What a big day we have today.
Yeah, a big day yesterday and today. And before we get into the news, Willie, it happened. All of this happened very quickly. But then again, so did the president's admissions. I gotta say, I was a little exasperated yesterday hearing one talking head, a news analyst, a news host after another going, well, we don't know if there are going to be any revelations in the transcript or any revelations in the they're saying it may be anticlimactic. Well, it's anticlimactic because the bank robber
is out.
Already told you he robbed the bank. So for these people, and I heard
this is not the Mueller report.
I heard some people last night who I have respect for saying, well, this is really going to blow up in the Democrats' face if the whistleblower complaint is not that huge. What do you mean? We already know the President of the United States reached out and pushed the Ukrainian government to go and investigate a domestic political rival 8 times, according to the Wall Street Journal. 1 time would have been enough. What else do we know? The president also told us that he held up military aid to a country in a hot war against Vladimir Putin and Russia until he had a chance to pressure this foreign leader 8 times. And so all of that information that has come out already from newspapers has pushed Donald Trump to admit things that, my God, over the past 240 years would have seen as impeachable offenses in themselves. And now we've got news people once again playing into Donald Trump's hand by going, well, we don't know if this transcript's going to tell us anything new. What new do we need to know that an inquiry should start?
He just says it out loud time and again. He did it with Russia. He's doing it again now. He said it out loud that he called up the president of Ukraine and talked to him about Joe Biden and looking into Joe Biden's alleged corruption. Yesterday now, I know we'll get into this, but the president changed as he walked into the UN before he made his speech to the General Assembly, the rationale for talking to the president of Ukraine. Remember, he was very deeply concerned about corruption. That's why he talked to him.
Yes.
Well, now he's saying, well, I'm very deeply concerned that Europe's not paying enough in military aid to Ukraine, which also is not true, by the way, and I know we'll get into that. So he's all over the place. Rudy Giuliani's all over the place. Remember, Rudy Giuliani said last week on CNN, quote, of course I did, talked to Ukraine about Joe Biden. There's something else, though, that I want to bring Richard Haass on quickly here, and that is this question of the transcript. It turns out there may not be a transcript. In fact, there probably is not a transcript. So the whistleblower complaint becomes all the more important. But as someone who's listened in on some of these calls from a president to a world leader, how does it work exactly? And what kind of a document, what kind of a, quote, transcript will we see out of the conversation? Yeah, Willie, the word transcript suggests people, a stenographer in court or someone working from a recording. In my experience, and I worked in the Bush 41 White House, that never happened. You would normally have a National Security Council staff person would be on the line listening in, and he or she would write down what they thought were the salient points. The foreign leaders, said the following things. So out of a half-hour phone call, you might have a 1.5 page memorandum of conversation that would essentially give you the highlights. Very rarely did it highlight the fact that the president might have misspoke about something. So these are interpretive memoranda produced by a staff member. They are not absolute records of what transpired. Plus, it never captures things like tone of voice, doesn't capture facial expression, doesn't capture larger context. It's just in isolation. And Mika, this from an administration that manipulates weather maps with Sharpies. So the idea that you would trust an account of a phone call that's produced by the White House makes you look elsewhere for evidence.
Well, this was just too much. In the wake of a growing scandal involving President Trump and Ukraine, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has announced plans to launch a formal impeachment inquiry against the president. Pelosi, who has resisted calls for impeachment for months, argued yesterday that Trump's actions reveal a betrayal of his oath of office.
The actions taken to date by the president have seriously violated the Constitution, especially when the president says, Article 2 says I can do whatever I want. I'm announcing the House of Representatives moving forward with an official impeachment inquiry. I'm directing our 6 committees to proceed with their investigations under that umbrella of impeachment inquiry. The president must be held accountable. No one is above the law.
So to keep in mind, everyone at this point, including the Speaker of the House here, staying behind the story, not jumping in front of it. We have the story. The president has said what he has done and even lied about it. And that is the information we're working with. And that is the information in which there are many questions to ask. Pelosi's announcement came after a meeting with the caucus yesterday where 187 House Democrats have voiced support for some kind of impeachment action. According to a Democratic aide who was in the room, Pelosi said, quote, "We have to strike while the iron is hot. This is a national security issue, and we cannot let him think that this is a casual thing." Pelosi also told members about a phone call she had with President Trump yesterday morning. 3 sources tell NBC News that President Trump asked Pelosi, quote, "Hey, can we do something about this whistleblower complaint? Can we work something out?" She responded saying, "Yes, you can tell your people to obey the law."
John Meacham, as a presidential historian, your thoughts as you take in the extraordinary events rapidly changing over the past 24 hours.
Well, it was a day where the system began to work. And I think a lot of us have thought that, in fact, the system would ultimately prevail, and it's still early. But what we saw from the very beginning of the Republic, from Montesquieu writing about divisions of power and Madison translating that into the American vernacular and reaching a point where for 243 years we've had this remarkable experiment where it's fallen out of balance here and there, but by and large has pressed forward. That has required people of character in the Congress to say that this is what we want, and there's a line over which you cannot go. A lot of folks would have drawn that line earlier, but the line has been drawn now. It's very clear that in terms of the framers' intent of the foreign influence and that sort of thing, this is in that zone. It's not even in the zip code. It's in the House. And, I think that ultimately we're going to see a test right now of whether facts and truth matter. Will President Trump's base look at this and accept the facts, or will they accept whatever story, the next story he's going to tell?
Yeah, John Heilman, so many, including us, talk about Donald Trump's base, talk about how those that have stayed with Donald Trump all along, whether they will remain with him. What I found compelling about this story over the past 24 hours is that you had a group of moderate members of Congress from swing districts, many of whom represent voters who voted actually for Donald Trump in 2016, that weren't sticking their finger up in the wind, trying to figure out which way things were moving. They were saying, we have no choice now. As David Ignatius said in a Washington Post must-read op-ed this morning, this is more than partisanship. This is about a commander-in-chief who actually is meddling with America's national security for political interests.
Right. And, I think, Joe and Mika, we've spent for the last at least 6 months and maybe longer asking the question, what will it take to get Democrats to put political calculus and calculations aside and focus on their institutional responsibility and take this step, which is really what this is. It's a crapshoot on the politics. But it's clear what the institutional prerogatives here are and responsibilities are. It's clear that the president has admitted to, as you pointed out, an impeachable offense. There were others in the Mueller report that were listed, but that wasn't enough. We found out what was enough. What was enough was the president, by making this phone call to the president of Ukraine, trying to do the exact same thing in 2020 that he did in 2016. This was believing that he could behave not just with impunity, but with such impunity that he could again importune a foreign power, only this time as president of the United States, as opposed to just the Republican nominee, to get involved in an American presidential election in a way that would benefit him and disadvantage at this point, his most likely primary political opponent. And that apparently was the thing where people said, okay, history will not allow us to acquiesce in that, letting the president do this twice, the exact same thing 2 elections in a row. And so, yes, I think it's obviously Nancy Pelosi, who is, Mike Allen said in the previous hour that she's a numbers girl. A source of his said that to him. She obviously has been canvassing the same 40 or so House Democrats who are vulnerable, and she's been asking them throughout, is this impeachment? What's the situation with this impeachment inquiry? How do you feel about it? I don't want to do anything that will imperil you politically. That changed over the course of the last 7 days. Those members started, sometimes publicly and sometimes privately, to say either it's fine for our politics or we don't care about our politics. We just think that this is intolerable and we must go forward. So that's where we are, and I think John Meacham's right. I think there's a decent chunk of the Trump base that will not be moved by this, regardless of what the facts are, because the president's clearly going to try to turn this whistleblower into Andy McCabe and is going to demonize and shame this person, whether they become public or not. And some amount of the Trump base will just believe that. But I think that there is a large question about the weaker part of the Trump support in the Republican Party and whether they will be moved by the plain facts here.
Right. And, Willie, you have the president, of course, changing alibis every day.
Yep.
He, of course, was talking about
Really
Europe
spinning.
not cooperating, not contributing, when, in fact, when it comes to assistance, they've actually paid more than double what the United States has paid in 2016 and 2017. But you go back to the first reason the president admitted to holding up that military aid. It was because he wanted to talk about, quote, corruption, specifically Joe Biden. He has admitted it. So this actually goes well beyond 2016 and Russia. This has to do with America's national security, about Russian aggression, military aggression, holding up funding in a hot war where Putin has invaded from the east. And Donald Trump is holding up that money again until he can get assurances that his political domestic rival will be slimed, that dirt will be dug up on him. It is beyond the pale.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.